I want to go now to Mr. Greg Hodgin. Greg of the ZC Institute. He's going to present a model for a new type of propulsion system that's based on initially the research into the Alcubierre drive. He believes that warp fields can be generated efficiently and used as a means of producing fusion energy, which can then in turn be fed back into the warp field for propulsion purposes. So I guess I could just do a few words, before Greg goes on. I've been talking to Greg over the last couple of weeks off and on. Mark Sokol actually connected with him and forwarded him to me. So if you're familiar with the Alcubierre drive, that's definitely kind of a start, but he's doing a lot of really, really innovative stuff. One of them is his team is looking at how to use that to potentially generate fusion, right, to power the device. And another thing that they're doing is looking at pulsing their warp drive, rapidly pulsing it, right, like potentially even the megahertz range. And so there's a lot of innovation that he's trying to put into this. So without any further ado, let me bring Mr. Greg Hodgin on and ask him to unmute, sir.
Of course. And Tim, thank you so much. I very much appreciate the introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Greg Hodgin. I'm the executive director. I've been running a nonprofit for so damn long. I'm the CEO of ZC Institute, which we started about, it's been about 1.5 years right now. And I'm going to do my best not to take up the entire hour because I don't have that much to say, but I'll do the best I can with what time I've got. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with respect to the to what we're doing here. Let's see. Let's do that, and everyone should be able to see that, right? Good. Okay.
Yeah, it looks wonderful, Greg.
Oh, excellent. That's good because my graphic design abilities are shit. All right. So ZC Institute, this is what we're talking right now. What we're kind of focusing on right now is the first couple of stages of the program, but because of what APEC is about, I'm going to actually dive all the way into stage 4 or phase 4 of our program. But right now, stage 1 actually is going to be dealing with the energy crisis and the fact that by 2050, the world's going to need about 25 trillion kilowatt hours. And the average American home uses about 11,000 kilowatt hours. So that's more than 2 billion US homes by 2050. And that's really conservative. We're probably going to need a lot of power, like a great deal. That's a 500% energy increase from now until then. We, of course, have a number of polluting power sources. No matter what you use, there's usually some sort of cost to it. Even geothermal, you've got to drill it somewhere. Hydroelectric, you got to build a dam somewhere. You have environmental issues. If you're using fossil fuels, of course, you're producing a great deal of carbon emissions. There's all kinds of things, right? And there's a limited supply. Sure, we can do solar, but unfortunately, the sun has this bad habit of going away at night. We don't know where it goes. So we can't use it all the time, which is very sad. So no matter what we do, we're going to have to figure out some sort of something with respect to the energy crisis. So we are doing work with quantum space-time distortion technology and warp technology, but we are trying to approach it more as a fusion startup company. The reason is because a lot of investors, in fact, most of them, don't really want to give money to macroscopic warp drive devices. But boy, when you say fusion, they really start paying attention for some strange, unfathomable reason, which we'll get into later on. The thing about nuclear fusion right now, of course, and I'm talking to a bunch of engineers, and by the way, just for the record, I'm not an engineer, nor am I a scientist in that way. My work has actually been in history and political science, which we'll get into later on. But when it comes to fusion, there's usually 2 main ways to do it. You're talking about using a tokamak or you're using laser confinement. Either way, you are engaging in a brute force approach. You're heating something up very, very hot, and you're creating a ton of pressure to force them to fuse together. So you're actually trying to overcome massive forces with respect to overcoming Coulomb forces to force hydrogen or helium-3 or whatever it is to actually fuse. We've got a kind of a way we can get around that. Now, if those of you haven't read anything about the warp drive, Dr. Miguel Alcubierre, 1994, actually kind of said what's on this screen right now, which is there's a nice cheat. Matter nor energy can usually exceed the speed of light, but space-time certainly can. In fact, there's no limit to how fast space-time can expand. And a warp drive warps space-time itself inside a warp bubble. So you're basically compressing space-time in front of whatever you're compressing in front of, and you're expanding it behind it. So to an external observer, anything inside the warp bubble can move at any arbitrary velocity, including above the speed of light, depending on how much energy you pump into it. Now, according to some of the research right now, and most of the research is saying that you're going to need exotic matter for FTL warp drives, faster than light. But subluminal, according to some of the more recent papers, specific Bobrick and Martier in 2021, Eric Lentz in 2021, and also Phil Heisenberg, subluminal warp drives do not require exotic matter. They only require regular matter and energy. And this gives us the opportunity to develop and master the technology before attempting FTL. The idea is that basically you have training wheels for sublight and you work your way up to FTL. And only within the past year or so has theoretical warp drive become possible and practical at all. Most scientists, the conventional science basically says that it's still theoretical, as the power requirements are pretty high. One of the main reasons behind that, though, is that most of the theoretical papers set an arbitrary radius for what they were trying to build a warp drive about, which is R equals 100 meters. That's enough to, kind of build something like this behind me, which if you haven't watched yet, Discovery, it's hit or miss. But our idea was a couple of things. One, you start out very small. Two, you start with sublight only. Three, you're going to pulse the drive, and I'll walk through each of those things. So one, you start small. The amount of energy required to create a warp field is actually directly proportional to the radius of the field. So if you're doing R equals 100 meters, which is macroscopic, that's a lot of power. Even with Lentz's paper discussing how to basically cheat with geodesics, you're still looking at 0.1 solar masses equivalent. That's a lot of energy. That's a lot of power. So we're starting very small, nanometers or angstroms instead. Maybe nanometers, maybe angstroms, maybe micrometers. Depends on what's going on. Depends on what we're going to do in the lab. We're not entirely sure which one's going to actually work or not. The other main thing is we pulse the drive. One of the issues with the Alcubierre drive and a lot of its derivatives is the fact that when you turn it on, you are cut off from the space-time continuum. So I'm sure a bunch of you are dorks like me. So think about Star Wars hyperspace. You can't just drop out for the hell of it. You put it in, you turn it on, and you go until you either you hit a big massive gravitational thing or you get to your destination. You cannot change course in hyperspace. Our idea, though, with pulsing the drive is each time that you turn it on, yes, you're cut off, but when you turn it off, you're back in contact with the rest of the universe. So you can actually begin sending electromagnetic communications or whatever you need to with respect to that. That also means we don't have to warp space-time at a very high amount. We don't have to do kilometers or light years at a time. We can do it micrometers at a time or a millimeter at a time. Good example, if we're warping space-time at 1 millimeter per pulse, and we do it at 100 gigahertz, that yields an observed velocity of 1 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. That's a third of the speed of light. It ain't FTL, but got everyone else beat. Our idea here is to show proof of concept of the ability to warp space-time at a quantum level at subluminal velocities. We don't have to go very fast. We don't have to do 0.5 C. We don't do 0.3 C. Even showing that we can warp space-time at all, just doing what's a symmetric warp bubble, you're warping space-time around it. That's enough to show proof of concept. We gained a patent on this technology, which will have a lot of immediate applications for certain industries, such as computing and telecommunications. We license patents out, we buy their products, and each time that we do our research, each time that we keep building on this, we're going to be building bigger and bigger warp fields. And one of the important things that we're looking at, and one of the reasons why we think we have a shot of actually getting this funded, is we're going to apply this technology to nuclear fusion. We think that there is a way to actually use quantum space-time distortions in this way to actually facilitate sustainable nuclear fusion. And I'll go into that, why that is in just a bit. But once we get that, we can kind of move on from there. One of the main issues that we see with a lot of these warp fields and warp technology itself is the power requirements. If you've ever seen South Park, you've ever seen the underpants gnomes. We have the same problem with respect to warp drive technology, which is, of course, if you haven't seen the underpants gnomes, it's a bunch of underpants gnomes coming in and steal people's underpants, hence the name underpants gnomes. And one of the kids asks them, what's your business model? And they say, oh, step 1, steal underpants. Step 2, step 3, profit, right? And so we kind of feel the same way when it comes to this, because a lot of people going warp drive, proof of concept, let's build the enterprise. Well, where the hell is your power source? Where are you getting your power from? And a lot of people are going, well, we'll just we'll use exotic matter. It runs itself and da-da. A lot of this is way out there, right? You're going to need a really strong power source. And there's really only two that'll work, right? There's fusion and there's matter and antimatter. And we don't have the technological expertise as a civilization right now to really build, to really create and maintain the amount of antimatter we're going to need to do this stuff. We ain't to Star Trek yet, unfortunately. Fusion, on the other hand, we do have an idea of what we can do about that. So here's the idea behind, and again, I'm going to go into the business model, why we think this is going to work for us. This is one idea of what it might look like until we actually go in and engage in this research and actually really dive in and begin doing replicable experiments. This is one idea, might be another one. If you look at this right now, the black circle in the center, that's inside the warp bubble. Nothing happens inside. That's non-relativistic. So nothing affects that if the warp field is built correctly. The red, you guys can see my pointer, right? I'm hoping you can. If you can't, you good. Okay, you can. Cool. So this red piece right here, we're not sure what this is going to be. It might be electrons, might be protons, so it might be an electrical charge. It might be a positive charge. It might be electromagnetic radiation. I've got one team that's working with radio frequencies. We're not sure yet, but the point is that you're going to create this very thin shell, which is why, if you'll notice right here, 1 or 2 angstroms, we're talking really small. We're going to make something very dense. The key here, though, is this nice little purple, almost like a very, very thin little purple piece right here. That's the magnetic confinement. And that's where the key to the pulsing actually comes from. If you're using charged particles inside, what you can do is that you can actually, the warp field is basically this very dense, thin shell, right? Which means that if I expand the magnetic field, if I expand the magnetic bottle, the warp field shuts off because it doesn't have the density required to actually create the warp effect, right? Now it's quote unquote off. Some of our calculations and some of my teams have actually shown that when the warp field is quote unquote on, you cannot send electromagnetic radiation into or out of the bubble. It almost acts like a deflector shield because it's so damn dense, nothing's going to be able to get in, right? Which means that, again, this is where Alcubierre's idea came from, or where some of his conclusions came from of once you turn it on, you're cut off from the space-time continuum because light or electromagnetic radiation cannot interact with what's inside the warp bubble. You're cut off. But if I cut it off, now I can send electromagnetic radiation inside or out, right? And even better, if I can cut it off, if I'm just expanding the magnetic field, that means I can contract it again. So if you're prone to seizures, don't look at this. But the idea here is that you can turn it on and off several hundred, several thousand times a second. Now, people kind of say, well, that's, you're trying to get to terahertz or megahertz, something like that. That'd be nice. We'd like to do something relatively simple like this at the beginning. If we just turn the thing on and off, that'd be lovely, wouldn't it? That would be the best idea in that regard. We have to remember that when you're building technology, you're creating technology that's nature. Let's look at James Watt and the steam engine. He built a steam engine. It was shit, but it worked, which was the point, right? You get several generations of people working on this thing and they're improving on it, right? The first generation is always garbage. But the point is to show that you can actually do it, right? So that's kind of our phase one. We're building a research team, we're acquiring office space. We're looking to work with 6 to 8 labs. Our goal is we're the for-profit corporation. We want to give labs money. You're doing warp drive work, and there's some people who I've already got 2 MOUs right now with 2 labs that I'm working with. We've actually done 1 NSF grant. The idea is that they're each approaching this in different ways. If you have 6 labs, 5 are going to fail. 1 might not. And that's the key, right? Each of these labs is doing their own thing and they're actually chasing their own theory. But if we can coordinate them all and basically build a research consortium, 1, we can hand out equity to the labs themselves and the people who worked at the labs, because let's be honest, if you're doing this stuff, you should probably earn something from the research that you're doing, just besides a flat check. Secondly, this is a way for us to produce profits so that people will actually come in and give us money as opposed to nonprofits. There's a lot of these labs who are working on $200,000 every year or something like that. And that's not that much money, right? So the goal for us at the very beginning is just to show proof of concept of this actually happening, to show with a replicatable experiment that has been peer reviewed and also published in a respected journal or several respected journals, hopefully, that we can do this. And to show warping in space-time, you only need an interferometer. It's not difficult. The equipment is not that difficult at all to actually put together from what I've heard. Hopefully, we're thinking between years 3 and 7, we'll get the first couple of patents on a proof of concept. And it's not going to just be the lab experiment. It's going to be how you built it and what's going on with that, right? With respect to phase 2, now we're looking at an acquisition of a site for a testing facility. We're looking at that. Again, we're still working with all the labs because now we have proof of concept. Let's say that 5 of them fail. 1 of them after 3 to 4 years goes, hey, look, we've got something cool. Let's go down this road, right? We can actually renegotiate our contract with those labs and say, you're going down a dead end, or this might not work as well as it could. Let's turn towards something else. Let's go ahead and redirect where you guys are going, right? Each time that we do this, each time that we're creating a larger warp field, make it more efficient, going back to steam engine, that's another set of patents. And that's another set of licensing that we can go out. So if you're starting with micrometers, you can go to millimeters, you can go to centimeters, and so on and so forth. And When we're discussing controlled nuclear fusion, I know a lot of you are kind of going, where does that come in? The answer is, if I can warp spacetime, so if I can contract spacetime with one warp field, if I set up several warp fields in a certain configuration or several certain configurations, that means I can take a small volume and arbitrarily compress it to whatever I want to, correct? If that's the case, that also means that I don't need deuterium or tritium. I can use protium. I can use carbon. I can, we've all seen it. Into Back to the Future. When Doc Brown pulls into the driveway and he just goes to the garbage and just starts dumping shit into Mr. Fusion, we might be able to pull that off because as long as you're not iron, you're still getting energy out of it. We don't know exactly how that's going to work yet because we still don't know exactly what the properties of the warp field are going to be. But if we can do this correctly, and we're thinking, I'm not going to say exactly how many warp fields it's going to take us to be more than one. Once you get it charged up and now take a lot of energy, you don't need to recharge it every time because again, when you're pulsing it and you're cutting and you're expanding the magnetic field, you're not cutting it off, so you're not dissipating the charge. That means that I can turn it on and off, and I'm only have to put a small amount of energy to keep it going. So you can almost build like a fusion engine. You have an intake step where the warp fields are off. It comes in, you do your compression stage, you have your ignition stage, and you have your exhaust stage, right? It's like, it is literally like what's in your car, except of course, it burns hydrogen instead and not with chemical stuff. It does it with fusion instead. That's the concept. That's the idea. And what's lovely about this is the fact that because you're only using protium, hopefully, you can just use water. That's just going to be electrolysis for water into hydrogen and oxygen. That's a little bit of sulfuric acid. Mwah, there you go. So then your byproduct is going to be helium, electrons, and well, oxygen, because you're actually cutting water in half. The nice thing about this as well is the fact that because you're using a fusion reaction, you're producing a direct electrical current. You're getting electrons that are kicking off themselves. And depending on how you set the warp fields and magnetic containment, you can just basically create a stream of electricity, no turbine required, which is even better. Now, that being said, we will have to wrap the fusion reactor in some sort of jacket, right? Because thermo's thermo and you can't cheat thermo. But we can go ahead and hook that up. My one of the labs we're working with he's a fusion guy. His name is Dr. Jason Cassabury. He's actually at the University of Alabama, Huntsville. He does fusion engineering. When I showed him this stuff, he squeaked like a schoolgirl at a K-pop concert when he found out what we were doing, because it solves a lot of the issues that he was looking at with respect to fusion engineering. However, he did say, I know you want to do the 21st century stuff, but you're going to need a turbine. So the joke was he's going to spray on the side of the turbine, ye old fusion reactor, and call it a day. But you're still getting a large amount of power with respect to that. And because these warp fields are microscopic, because we're talking about on the micrometer or maybe nanometer scale, you can build a fusion reactor about this big. That's not a lot. We don't need to build these huge things where we're firing God only knows how many trillions of watts of power with a laser into this thing. We can build it smaller, which also means that we're not getting this big, massive spike of energy when the nuclear reaction actually happens. We can kind of tailor the reaction to what we want to, so you can kind of dial it up and down the way that you want to, right? Now we're producing a ton of power. Once we start producing a ton of power, now, again, we built the James Watt version of the fusion reactor 1.0. Now everyone and their mom's going to be jumping in on this, right? Now everyone's going to be doing this research on figuring out how to make this the most efficient way and using the least amount of energy to get it started up as possible, and what else we can burn with it, and so on and so forth, right? It's going to be plenty of ways to kind of go forward with that. Now, we now have fusion power. Now we can begin discussing macroscopic warp drives. Now we can discuss building one that's a meter or 10 meters or things like that. And this is where it gets really fun. Now we can actually begin terrestrial warp flight. We can actually begin working with, again, if you're doing a third of the speed of light, I can go up and be in Nairobi in 4 seconds from Atlanta. So, now there will no longer be the 4-hour layover in Atlanta, which if you live in Atlanta, which I do, the joke is when you die, there'll be a 4-hour layover in Atlanta before you go to heaven or hell, because it's Atlanta. And we can even do Mars flights. We can be there in about 8 minutes one way. The drive is not inertial. Because we're pulsing it, when you turn it on, of course, you cut off. When you cut it off, whatever inertial frame you started in, you're going to end up in. So you can literally go up, and then if you want to, you can go to the left or to the right, or you can go diagonally, wherever you want to, right? And that's one of the nice things about pulsing it, is because now, because we're pulsing it, because each time that you make that warp field a bit, you stretch out the magnetic field. Now, all of a sudden, I get telemetry several 100,000 times a second, which means there's an object coming towards me. I can change my direction on the fly. Now, There's no such thing as a free lunch. Thank you, Robert Heinlein. And the issue with this is that because it's non-inertial, when I do cut it on, or if I do cut it off, whatever inertial frame I was in, that's where I'm at now. So if I go into orbit, I'm not orbiting. I just drop like a rock. Like that's just what's going to happen. The idea behind that is that we're going to go ahead and throw on a back-on fusion propulsion system because now we have a fusion reactor. Might be a lot easier to do that, right? We're still working through that one. Again, this is why this is phase 3. Of course, by phase 4, now we can actually begin building macroscopic warp drives that can go out into the solar system. We can colonize the solar system. We're thinking 28 to 30 years. We're thinking about April 5th, 2063 to be exact. That's my personal goal. I'd like to do it sooner, but if we can do it by then, that'd be great. I know there's Vulcans are waiting. The goal would be we'll actually launch our first FTL. And we're thinking that the first FTL flight will not be this, it's not this theoretical impossibility. It's more like the X1. It's an engineering question. How fast can I pulse it? And how much must I build? How much must I warp each pulse to get over the speed of light? It's not going to be this neat thing of like we go from 0 to warp speed and light speed immediately. It might be like we're doing 0.99 for a while, and then we figured out we go to 1.1 or something like that. Like we're not sure exactly how it's going to work. And this is where I come in. So I'm a weird guy. I don't do engineering. I don't do science. I'm a political scientist. I do social science. So I deal with people. We need weird, unusual people. We need people who think outside the box, and we want people who we can nurture outside the box. I want people who, when they wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and want to call me with an idea, they can feel they can do that. Or they can go into the office and play their video game or throw darts or play pool or drink their alcohol or whatever drugs they want to use as long as they're legal. Or there's the quiet library room. I don't care. I need neurodiversity. I need people who think weirdly. I need people who think about weird shit all the time. And I need them to work with me because that's something else too. No one works for me. They work with me because we have a mission together, right? And for me, doing the political science thing, a corporation is just state building. It's just private state building, right? And the reason why it's so important to build early, you're all sitting in front of a computer right now. So I'm going to ask you all to look down at your keyboard, and you're going to see. Put your hands on your home keys, right? Put your hands on your home keys, and it's ASDF JKL semicolon, right? These are most certainly not the most typed letters in the English language. In fact, the semicolon, are you kidding me? E is above and C is below and comma and period are below, right? Now, the story is not entirely true, but it still makes the point. This keyboard was designed, of course, for typewriters, a physical device where when you hit a key, a hammer would go and smack into a piece of paper, right? If you type too fast, the hammers jam. So this was designed to slow you down. Why do we still use it? Because we've been using it for 150 years. And the thing is that to retrain everybody would require everyone chunking their keyboards and training on a new one, right? We already have the skill. Let's just stick with this one, right? In political science, this is called path dependency. When you create a concept or an idea at the beginning, whatever you've created, it kind of becomes frozen into it. It becomes frozen in and it gets locked in, whether you like it or not. So whatever things you pick, if you want to change down the road, it is far more difficult to change them down the road. In fact, usually you have to have a massive exogenous shock to the system to fix something. Good example, the international economic system. Bretton Woods happened at the end of World War II. For those of you who do not know, Bretton Woods system is actually what kind of is, it's why the currency of reserve in most countries is the US dollar. It's why if you do aviation, the international language of aviation is, it's English because we wrote the rules. Telecommunications, if you're in the United States, our country code is 1. Why? Because we're number 1, go USA, rah, rah, Eagle, all that good stuff. But because we wrote the rules. Because we haven't had a large exogenous shock since then, there has been no push to change those rules, even though the world has changed a lot since 1945, right? Path dependency is a thing and it's important. If you don't get your stuff set up right, it might screw you down the road. Hand dryers and DEI. We're really pushing for diversity, equity, and inclusion for a really big reason. Oh, 2 reasons. One, if you're building a warp drive, you should probably look at Star Trek, and Starfleet was kind of all into DEI since the 60s, so think about that. Secondly, a good friend of mine who actually does DEI for a living talked to me about how she was working with people who designed, the hand dryers in airports. So you put your hands under it and dries you and all that good stuff. And this one had like, it could blow like the toupee off of somebody or something like that, right? She asked him, did you test it with different people? Yeah, we did. We tested it with different people, so on and so forth. Goes to market. Someone sticks their hands around there. It was a black person. It doesn't pick up because the skin color did not activate the sensor. So they screwed half their market up because they tested it, but they didn't test it over everybody, right? Everyone from a physical and from a mental perspective has usually had different stuff. They have different things going on, right? You need a big sample size, but it can't just be a bunch of straight white guys. You've got to have other people who are looking in, because a lot of those different experiences will help us understand what the hell's going on, right? When it comes to this stuff, especially, you want engineers, you want scientists, you want people who think outside the box, but you also want to think about people who aren't scientists and engineers who are thinking outside the box, because they might tell you something that you never thought of, which is the point, right? And again, we want to build to last. I'm going to die at some point in the future. I'm not planning on it. I'm going to, keep living until I don't. But I'm pretty sure I'm going to die. If anyone has a solution to that, I am listening. But until then, I got a plan to make sure that the company I build will last as long as I need it to for this 30, 40, 50 years, right? And when it comes to this as well, we're going to ride Roman. The idea behind that is that you keep one foot in the past. You always look at your history, see what's going on, and keep one foot in the future. Where are you going and where you want to go, right? And of course, with the act of writing itself, you're in the present. So you're trying to stay, you're trying to make sure that you learn from your lessons. You pick up the historical things that you need, and you move on from there. And that's me. The reason that when we approach investors, one of the nice things we can say is that because I've already done a lot of this work at the United Nations, we can actually build a lot of public-private partnerships. Every dollar you give me, I can get $1 or more from the federal government. And that's kind of a really big thing. So in case people think I'm lying, here's my UN badge. There you go. It's actually still good until 2022. There's a way to actually make sure that you're always in front of the government and to make sure that they are paying attention to what you're doing. We have a number of scientific partners. Two of those guys we've actually signed MOUs with, Dr. Chansky and Dr. Jason Casper, working on MOUs with the other ones as well. And my CEO actually advises U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's got 30 years of operations experience. He's a cyber terrorism expert, because we know that if this works out correctly, the Chinese and the Russians will be watching us. And the nice thing is that I kind of understand great power politics. That's what I kind of took my comprehensive exams in. So I kind of know what's coming. A lot of people say, are you not worried about the government? I'm like, no, we haven't done anything yet. When we do something, and if the government wants to take my stuff, they can take their best shot. But the government is incentivized to actually get me to finish my stuff. They want me to finish working. My biggest concern is the Russians and the Chinese. The Chinese will steal it. The Russians will invite me to stay in a hotel, and then for some reason, the 15th story window magically disappears and I fall out of it. That's my concern. But as of right now, we're not there right now. Now, I see that the chat has blown up, so I'm going to kind of finish this for right now. I will do my best to answer your questions. Again, I like to reiterate the fact that I am not any kind of, I'm not a physical scientist. My physical science degree was in chemistry about 20 years ago. So, and I'm not an engineer, but I've learned enough to not be a complete idiot. So I'm going to shut the hell up and let everyone talk.
Greg, wonderful, sir. Before anything else, let me put this thing on gallery view. Everybody, please give Mr. Greg Hodgin an enormous applause. Greg, thank you so much. Yeah, and guys, please, you can put your hands up for questions, and let me find out how to do that. That is Alt-Y on Windows or Option-Y on Mac, and that helps us keep things a little bit more organized. So Greg, thank you for presenting that. I genuinely can't thank you enough. One of the things, and I mentioned this before, you're doing a lot of innovation on top of Alcubierre's original idea, which really excited me. So let me see. Let me go to Hal CC first. Okay, and let me see. He may be having issues. So let me go to Todd, Mr. Todd Desiato. And Todd, can you turn your camera on, sir? There we go. Oh, there we go. Todd, sorry.
Hi.
Give it a try now.
Have you read any of the papers I've written on I have several on warp drive and quantum gravity.
I think that they're in my hopper right now. If you could do me a favor, my email is actually down there. Send me everything that you got, and I'm happy to read them. It is, hold on one second. I'll show you this. I have done the best I can to collect a little bit of research. And anything that
those piles in my time.
Yeah. So anything I can add to this, I'm greatly appreciative for. I'm doing the best I can to keep up with not just this, but also the fusion stuff as well. But send me what you got, and I'm happy to read it. And I'm actually have to have a conversation with you later on.
Because a lot of the things that are issues in the work that came before me, I provide a way to look at it from quantum gravity that allows you to actually physically understand what's going on at a quantum level. And once you understand that, the whole concept of creating a warp bubble goes away. And it's all about how you manipulate the matter, not the space-time.
Yeah. Then definitely send that to me that way, because you're absolutely right in that regard. A lot of the research with respect to warp drive literature, the warp drive literature especially, is very heavily based in general relativity and not in quantum.
Yeah. And you were saying about path dependency.
Yep.
When Einstein came up with general relativity at the turn of the 20th century, the whole thing was about geometry, mathematics was the leading field at the time. And the Minkowski and Riemann and all of those people influenced him to look at this problem, which is simply looking at acceleration, to look at this problem in terms of geometry. And that path has stuck. But literally, the data that we have only says that geometry is a great description and interpretation, but the data can be interpreted in the reciprocal way, that it's not the geometry, it's what we measure with rulers and clocks that behave quantum mechanically that give us geometry.
It very much reminds me of the central dogma in biology for a while, and also the quest for DNA. The idea that, the data looks like this. Well, it's like you get locked in, and science is a really bizarre discipline. It is insanely exploratory, and it's insanely progressive, and we're going to question everything. But once it kind of gets locked in, just like with any human system, it becomes locked in, right? And it takes a lot to shake it loose. And for the past, since the Copenhagen interpretation of the 40s and the 50s, like we've been locked in. There's GR and there's quantum, and and they don't touch and they don't talk to each other. And that has
fixed that, but
yeah. Oh, well, then I'm definitely down to see that, and I see other people hands up as well. So do me a favor, send that to me, and to everyone who's listening right now, I put my email that I'm using for this into the chat. So if you want to send me something, that's fine. Send me what you got, Todd. But
I wanted to mention one more thing. You're talking about doing quantum warp bubbles and things like that. And I, honest to God, I've been working on this kind of technology since the 1980s, even before Alcubierre. And I have come to the realization that the thrust or the lift that you get from this is proportional to the scale cubed. So if you want to lift your own weight, it's the size of, if you want to lift its own weight, it's the size of a football stadium. And if you're doing it on a bench top, the results are too small to measure, and your interferometer will give you noise.
Right, which is why we're not using it for velocity. We're not building an asymmetric bubble. We just want to do a symmetric one instead. That way you can just show the contortion of space-time. I see. Yeah, right. But again, we can have that conversation later on. That's the idea. And again, I'm not a scientist or engineer, and that's why we're actually doing multiple labs, because the nice thing about being a scientist especially is sometimes we're wrong. Sometimes, especially if we're really lucky, we're not. But if we've got 6, 7, 8 labs working on different things, we're in a different story, right? And I see someone's got their hand up, and I'm going to shut up because we have a moderator.
Yeah. Well, and so let me mention. So we are going to have an open discussion after Mark's presentation. he's got the Podkletnov Impulse generator. We have Todd's warp drive. We got a bunch of stuff. Todd's ion drive. Sorry about that. So I'm mixing my terms up. And so, Greg, I'm not sure if if you want to stick around or if you want to come back in later. I mean, yeah, those open sessions, and they can say from experience, sometimes those go. I've had them go until 10 o'clock at night Pacific. So sometimes 5 or 6 hours.
And that's fine. So my thinking is I'm going to actually hop off of this because it's 4:30 where I am after this, and then I'm going to come back in later on.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Okay. But I'm down to answer stuff as well. So let's go.
Yeah. So let me go to Hal CC. And sir, if you could turn your camera on, sir or ma'am, and let me ask you to unmute.
I don't have a camera. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I came in on the tail end of this program here by Mr. Hodgin. What was he speaking about? In brief.
Well, what I would probably recommend is instead of restating the presentation, we are going to have a replay up. So why don't you visit our website at altpropulsion.com. We're going to have it up there. Another place that you can look up is Jeremy Reese Alien Scientist YouTube channel, and you should be able to rewatch the entire thing.
Yeah, let me just ask quickly. He mentioned that he had some kind of relationship with Dr. Eric Lentz on the warp drive. Dr. Lentz himself encountered some difficulties later on through some other theoretical physicists. Just by any chance, Mr. Hodgson, do you happen to know if Mr. Lentz has resolved those difficulties such that he is getting further in his work? Because he was the first one who had any positive energy densities that worked with warp drive as compared to previous papers. Do you happen to know the status of his work?
That's actually a really good question. And yes, I do. Dr. Lentz, and you're right, there's a lot of pushback with respect to what he was doing. There's another paper that came out after Lentz's paper about 3 or 4 months after that by Dr. Fell and Sean Fell and Dr. Lavanya Heisenberg that also dove into the geodesics as well. Dr. Lentz actually produced a number of papers to back his theory up and to show what's going on, which have also been published in peer-reviewed papers as well. And he has mostly resolved his issues, but he also knows enough to know how much he doesn't know. And right now there is a bit of a, for lack of a better term, a froth with respect to how, what's going on in that regard, which is not a bad thing. And that's why I think one of the main things that's going to be required is going to be a good amount of experimental data research, because there's a lot of people talking in the theoretical physics field. And now it's just getting to the point where the energy requirements, if anyone's theory is correct, the energy requirements are where we can hit them in the lab. And when I say in the lab, I'm not talking about 2 car batteries and some, 10 wire and calling it a day. I'm talking about, we're gonna have to call the substation and let them know we're pulling a lot of power, but it can be done. I've talked to him off and on for the past year or so, and he is still moving on with his research. He's still doing the research, and he has not fixed all the issues, but he has, according to other people who are experts in the field as well, he has managed to mostly address the concerns that were given to him in that regard.
Wonderful. And I should apologize. I had to mute Hal out. He was getting some background noise. So
no problem.
And let me see. Let me ask him to unmute and see if he had anything. Oh, there we go.
Oh, by the way, Tim, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say thank you for clarifying it. And his work was the most advanced at all the people that I read on the paper, which I had some tentative understanding of. I'm an engineer, but I didn't understand it. But thank you for clarifying and responding to my question.
My pleasure. And I would like to point out as well that, again, he is still doing it, but his paper actually created a small explosion of other academic papers. So now there's a very active, people are citing him a lot, and a lot of the newer papers that are coming out are discussing exactly what you're talking about. Tim, before you go on.
Brendan had a question. Brendan,
I just wanted to ask Todd. He mentioned quantum gravity. He mentioned that, I'm not sure that he had a theory of quantum gravity. Because in conventional physics, when they say quantum gravity, they don't mean quantum gravity, they mean the search for quantum gravity. So I was just wondering, do you have a theory that of a real?
I have a model It's an engineering model. That's the title of the first paper, is an engineering model of quantum gravity. And I look at it, I take the interpretation, the reciprocal interpretation of general relativity as in terms of matter instead of space-time.
Now, if I could jump in, I want to try and keep things focused on Greg's presentation. Todd,
Yeah.
do you think that you might be able to speak on this later for Barton? I mean,
I'm
if you want, you haven't talked about it in quite a while. If I
prepared, but
if I could let me put my 2 cents in. So when I first heard about Todd's work, he's doing theoretical work. He's doing it from kind of an engineering perspective. I didn't have any opinions about it, but I said, well, I'm not sure, right? I just don't know what to think. And I started hearing from several people that I look up to and I trust. They said Todd's on the right track. So Todd, I really respect your work. It would be wonderful if you wanted to represent some of that, you know. I'm not a physicist
do an
either.
interview one of these days.
Yeah, as I mentioned to Greg earlier in the week, I'm not a physicist, but I play one on TV or something along those lines. So, but I'm way behind you guys.
I can post a link in the chat to the paper if you like.
Okay. Yeah, and I may take you up on the interview thing. I will once I get a little bit more caught up here. So. Okay, so let me see more questions for Greg. Harold had a question. Harold was saying, Greg, keep it going. You're in good track. Harold had a question for Justin earlier. Okay, well, so I think that's everything then. I think we're all set. Well, let me do this then. Let me put this thing back on gallery view. Everybody, please give another enormous applause for Mr. Greg Hodgin. Greg, that was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And again, my email is in there. I will be back later on today. I need to eat. But I'm happy to go into more detail about what we're doing, what's going on, and how we're going to do this with Fusion. And yeah, it's kind of fun. It's really fun to kind of do these things, and I'm excited to see where we're going to go. And we're starting to pick up a lot of steam. Like I said, a lot of people don't care about warp drive, but when you talk about using it for fusion technology, all of a sudden people start paying a lot more attention. And having that kind of power source means we can all do all kinds of really cool stuff that we can only dream of right now. You know. Oh.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, Greg, thank you again, sir. So